All right, today we're tackling one of the most fascinating, complex, and, let's be honest, sensitive topics in all of Islamic history. We're going to unpack the story of the so-called Satanic verses. Now, this is a narrative that has kept scholars and thinkers busy for literally centuries, and we're going to explore it based on some really solid academic research.
So let's start with a genuine historical mystery. I want you to picture Mecca, way back in the earliest days of Islam. You've got this small, new community of Muslims, and they are under immense pressure from the powerful Quraysh tribe, who, see this new faith as a major threat. These two groups are sworn enemies. But then one day, something happens that just doesn't make any sense. It's something that leads us to this question. What on earth could make the pagan Quraysh suddenly bow down in prostration, the ultimate act of Muslim worship, right alongside the very people they're persecuting? So, we're talking about a really critical time for the early Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad is reciting a brand new chapter from the Quran in Mecca, Surah Najm, the chapter of the star. And it's right in the middle of this incredibly powerful moment that something really weird happens. It's an anomaly that just begs for an explanation. And get this story comes from one of the most respected and authoritative sources in Sunni Islam, Sahih al-Bukhari. The text is pretty clear. When the Prophet finished reciting and bowed down, the hostile pagan Quraysh bowed down right there with him. Now, this wasn't a mass conversion. It was just this sudden, bizarre, collective act that seemed to defy all logic. So we know that it happened. But the question of why it happened, well, that's where the real story begins. The story of this event is also the story of how a narrative can completely change over time. It makes you wonder, how did an incident that early Muslim scholars talked about openly become something that's basically taboo for a lot of people today? Just look at this timeline. It shows a pretty dramatic shift. For the first few centuries of Islam, scholars like the great historian al-Tabari treated it like a historical event that needed explaining. Even centuries after that, major figures like Ibn Taymiyyah were still seriously debating it. But then the narrative starts to change. In the 19th century, Western scholars framed it as this huge controversy. And of course, Salman Rushdie's novel in the 80s just sealed the deal, making it a globally recognized taboo. The result? Over the last couple hundred years, it's been a total reversal, with most mainstream scholars now flat out rejecting the story.
And this quote from our source material really just hits the nail on the head. It's the central question, right? How did something go from being accepted as the truth to being its complete opposite? The journey of this one story is a perfect case study in how communities wrestle with their own past, and how truth can be shaped and reshaped by theology, culture, and history.
Okay, so back to those early scholars. How did they explain why the Quraysh suddenly prostrated? Well, over time, the tradition came up with three main theories to try and solve this historical puzzle. And each one tells a very different story with some seriously different implications. So let's lay them out. First, you've got the clean sweep theory, which is the simplest one. Then there's the partial hearing theory, where things get a bit supernatural. And finally, you have the most controversial one by far, the dicey deception. Let's break down what each of these actually means. So theory number one, the clean sweep. This is the version that a lot of traditionalist scholars prefer today. The idea is basically that the recitation of the Quran was just so powerful, so beautiful, that it completely overwhelmed everyone listening, including the pagan Quraysh, and they just couldn't help but prostrate. It's a nice, clean explanation for what happened, but it doesn't really explain why these sworn enemies would do something so totally out of character. Okay, now things start to get a little wilder with theory number two, the partial hearing. This one comes from major scholars like al-Tabari. The story goes that after the Prophet recited verses mentioning the pagan goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat, Satan himself jumped in and added 2 lines praising them. But here's the critical part. In this version, God performs a miracle. He shields the Muslims from hearing Satan's words, but the Quraysh hear them loud and clear. So they think, hey, a compromise, and they prostrate out of sheer joy. It definitely explains their actions, but, it leans pretty heavily on a very specific kind of miracle. And that brings us to the third theory. And this is the one that is just theologically explosive. It's called the dicey deception. In this version, there's no separate voice, no partial hearing. It suggests that Satan actually managed to trick the prophet himself into thinking these compromising verses were part of the divine revelation. So according to this narrative, the prophet says the words, the Quraysh prostrate, and it's only later that he realizes he was deceived. I mean, you can see the problem, right? The dicey deception theory goes right to the heart of Islamic belief about the prophet's infallibility, which raises this massive question. Why on earth would a hugely revered scholar like Ibn Taymiyyah, a guy literally called the scholar of Islam, ever accept a version of events that seems so damaging to the faith?
Well, the answer isn't really about history. It's about theology. For scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, this incredibly problematic story actually served a crucial purpose. They believed it was the key to unlocking a very specific and otherwise very confusing passage in the Quran itself.
And there it is. That's the motive. The whole reason for even considering the dicey deception story was that it provided a historical context, what scholars call a sabab al-nuzul, or a reason for revelation, for two specific verses in the 22nd chapter of the Quran, Surah al-Hajj. Without this event, those verses just kind of hang there, without an obvious explanation.
So take a look at the verse itself. This is the theological puzzle piece. You can see in both translations, the Quran says that whenever a prophet recites something, Satan can try to throw something into it or insinuate something, but God always fixes it. For a scholar like Ibn Taymiyyah, this verse seemed to perfectly describe the Satanic verses incident. For him, the event wasn't just plausible, it was actually necessary to make sense of the scripture. Okay, so where does all this leave us today? How do modern scholars look at the exact same evidence and come to a totally different conclusion? Let's get into the modern verdict on this whole thing. A huge contemporary work like the Study Quran basically flips that classical argument on its head. It says that instead of explaining Quran 2252, the story actually just obscured it. It made it harder to understand. And when you look at it with modern historical tools, the whole narrative kind of falls apart. The different accounts contradict each other, the timeline doesn't really work. It's just, in their words, strained and implausible. The modern take is that the historical evidence for the incident is way too shaky to support all the theological weight that was put on it. And you can see this modern reevaluation in newer Islamic movements like BioIslam. They pretty much reject those two controversial theories for a couple of big reasons. One, they say the whole idea of Satan interfering like that goes against the Quran's promise that the message is protected. And two, they argue that the classical scholars were basically building their case on a flawed foundation of stories that just weren't reliable. In the end, the long, tangled history of the Satanic verses leaves us with this really big question. It shows us this constant tension between historical stories and theological needs. It proves that what a community believes is truth isn't set in stone. It's something that's debated and built and rebuilt over generations. And this one incident, whether it was a real event or a later legend, forces us to ask ourselves, when our history and our faith seem to collide, how do we choose which story becomes the story?